So welcome everyone. I'm Carolyn Eswine with the Department of Urban Planning here at SAREP, and we're excited. This is our final Innovative Cities lecture. We have a great speaker today for the semester, and then we have quite a few that we're looking into for next spring. So watch for those emails. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on the traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes. We're the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Knickknick rivers.
Sorry.
Okay. Meet and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We feel it's important as planners who are working to create more equitable communities that we share the resources to deepen your knowledge. So we're excited to, again, share that with you this time. So welcoming today, we have Joe Peterangelo with us. And he is going to be, he's actually a senior researcher with the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and he's also an alum of our urban planning program. And he's going to be talking today about housing research, equitable, and sort of the opportunities, how research can influence those. As in the past, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat. And I will interject if it's appropriate. Otherwise, we will save time at the end for a small discussion. I believe Joe is going to be covering 3 different projects, so there might be a small pause, but we want to make sure he has enough time to complete. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out announcements of our spring Innovative Cities lectures soon. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Carolyn. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And it's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. And sorry about the technical issues at the beginning, but I'm happy to be here. Like Carolyn said, I am an alum of the urban planning program from 2010. And Carolyn was a professor of mine when I was there. So I've been with the Wisconsin Policy Forum basically ever since graduating from UW-M. And so my work there is really as a policy researcher, and not as a planner, but a lot of the work I do really is on issues that planners work on and care about as well. So for those not familiar with the Wisconsin Policy Forum, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit research organization. We've been around for over 100 years here in Milwaukee, and in 2018, we also merged with a Madison-based organization. So we now have both a statewide scope, and we still continue to do a lot of work really focused on Milwaukee. And my work at the Policy Forum is primarily in economic development, transportation, and housing. Those have been kind of the main areas I've worked in, but we cover a much broader range of issues at the forum. But here I'm showing you some of the reports that I've worked on in recent years, with others or independently, working on housing issues here in Milwaukee. All of these were pretty in-depth studies on different housing issues, and I want to share some of the research from a few of these, as well as some of the action that has taken place as a result. So the first piece I wanted to talk about is a project we did back in 2018 on eviction prevention. And the background for this was that the book Evicted was published in 2016 and won a Pulitzer Prize in 2017. And then the city, along with Common Bond Communities, which is a community organization that does a lot of affordable housing work, they came together and got a grant to put together a task force focused on eviction prevention. And so, the book had really focused on the issue of evictions in Milwaukee, but obviously this is a national issue, but really put the spotlight on this issue. So a lot of attention was placed on it. And so the idea of the project was, and our role was really to facilitate this task force that was formed and to provide research to help move along their conversations, and then to produce a report that would basically explain the scope of the problem, describe what was going on already in the community to address evictions, identify gaps and strategies for closing those gaps. And so this is the list of organizations that participated in that task force. It was a very large group, city and county well represented, but a lot of community organizations, as well as the Apartment Association, which is representing landlords. So it was a pretty broad group that met monthly for 5 months, and we worked through with them, looking at the issue and coming up with strategies. So first of all, at that time, when we looked at the number of evictions that were occurring in Milwaukee, we saw, over 6,000 every year in Milwaukee County, with most of those occurring in the city every year. And that was translating into 1 out of every 24 renter households in the city were evicted in 2016. And that included, when we looked at the census tract level, there were census tracts that had over 1 in 10 renter households had been evicted that year. So very widespread issue. Interestingly, when we compared this to other cities, Milwaukee didn't stand out quite as much as we might have expected based on the book and being highlighted so much nationally. It's obviously a very big problem in Milwaukee, but also a problem in a lot of other cities as well. And so then the work we did as a task force, we first worked to identify which organizations were doing what when it came to eviction prevention. This was really the first time that all of these organizations had come together and even thought of themselves as a network of eviction prevention service providers. That was something that they said they were making new connections. Sometimes, in some cases, there were connections, but as you can see here, there were a lot of different organizations providing different services, whether it was education, rent assistance, legal or mediation services, a lot of different types of services that help to prevent evictions, but weren't necessarily connected to one another. And so through the course of our conversations, we came to 4 strategies that the group felt would be effective in trying to improve the system of services in Milwaukee. The first was that this idea that there was no front door for eviction prevention services in Milwaukee. There's not a single place to go. So people kind of were out on their own, looking for help, talking to family and friends, maybe calling 211, but there wasn't really a place to go for this. And so there was support for the idea of creating a tenant and landlord resource center that would be sort of a one-stop shop, providing all different types of eviction prevention services for both landlords and tenants. There was a lot of support for existing mediation services that helped landlords and tenants come to agreements, kind of especially earlier in the process before an eviction went to court. And also there are legal representation services for tenants facing eviction, but in both cases, there was the feeling that there was not nearly the capacity needed to meet the demand for those types of services, that they're effective, but more demand was out there. Similarly, for financial assistance, one of the common common ideas was that a lot of cases when it comes to eviction just come down to small amounts of money in temporary situations, and there's just not enough rent assistance available to help households in those situations. And the last idea was to explore the possibility of establishing a housing court, which currently the way eviction cases are handled in Milwaukee is they go through small claims court, but because they're very unique cases that can result in a person losing their home, it's a very specific type of case. And so in some cities, we found they've established housing courts that acknowledge that the kind of uniqueness of those cases and provide supportive services to households, especially in the case when eviction does proceed. So this was just an idea that the group wanted to explore further. So we published our report in late 2018, and the group continued to meet and work towards actually implementing some of those recommendations or those strategies that were consensus items. And then in 2020, the big action that occurred was that the Milwaukee Rental Housing Resource Center was established downtown. And this is a center that serves as that front door. It brings together, co-locates all of those organizations that I showed earlier that provide different types of services. So there's information and education services provided at the center. There's rent assistance, mediation, legal representation. And basically it's the place to go, and people can be connected to whatever services they need, including landlords when they're, having a situation with a tenant that they want to resolve before, instead of filing for an eviction. The center has been used as the main place where rental assistance has been distributed over the last couple of years. There's been a huge influx in rent assistance from federal pandemic relief funds. And so that a lot of 10,000 unique households have been served through this center just in the last couple of years. The United Way also responded to this research and created a new initiative called Safe and Stable Homes. And so this takes a variety of different approaches to eviction prevention, focusing on families and preventing homelessness, ending family homelessness through increasing rent assistance, mediation services, and legal representation, which were things that came out of this project. And then the United Way also, with the county, has established this right to counsel program, which is a program that started about a year ago. And it's a pilot effort that is providing extended legal representation to households facing eviction, and is being evaluated over time to see if it's effective. So far, it has been quite effective. In the first 6 months, 73% of the households that received this extended legal representation the evictions were prevented. So that was very promising. It's a 3-year pilot though. And so then at the end of that pilot, it will be, evaluated again, and they'll have to determine how to extend it. And so a lot of action occurring on this issue. This is the data that Medical College of Wisconsin has continued to track the evictions in Milwaukee. And you can see that the numbers were relatively consistent prior to the pandemic. Then there was a complete drop-off in evictions. That was the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a moratorium in place. And evictions have, come back, but they seem to be at lower levels. And this is despite the fact that the number of evictions being filed, it has actually returned to pre-pandemic levels. As of fall 2021, those numbers had bounced back to pre-pandemic levels, but we're still seeing eviction numbers down. And that could be for a number of factors: the expanded rental assistance that's been available, and some of these other efforts that have been made. So it seems promising, but obviously something that we need to continue to follow to see how this continues. But that's all I wanted to share on that one. We can either take questions on that one now if people have them, or I can move into the next project.
There are no comments in the chat, so if you want to keep going on. And again, for anyone listening, you can type a comment in if you have a question.
Okay, great. So the second piece I wanted to share is kind of an interesting case study that I thought was really interesting as a person with a planning background. I think because it's really neighborhood based, and it really came out of a neighborhood plan that was developed in the Amani neighborhood on the north side. And this was a pilot effort to basically focus on housing improvements and housing revitalization on one block of Amani as kind of an example or a first step in trying to do neighborhood revitalization work, to see how that pilot effort what kind of impact it could make, and learn from it and hopefully expand to further areas of the neighborhood. Here you can see kind of the general boundaries of the Amani neighborhood on the north side and the purpose of the project. Understand what the pilot was, how it was structured and financed, what has happened so far, and what challenges have arisen during this pilot. Being that it was a pilot, there were bound to be challenges, and that was a key part of this project. And to then I also identify lessons learned and how the pilot could be improved upon in future similar work in the neighborhood or elsewhere in the city.
So Joe, based on your comment before that evictions are lower, but your other applications are the same, do you have a number right now? Do you know where evictions are at?
You mean geographically?
Well, I think they're also looking for a number, and then someone is asking a correlation between evictions by individual. Let me pop that back up here. So is there a correlation between evictions by individual property owners versus management companies? But the other question is, do you have numbers again on who's actually being evicted? Is it individuals with disabilities, or is that, I don't know if that's tracked.
Yeah,
do you have data on that?
I don't have that level of detail. I know that at the time, I know that we had found that, or a lot of research has been done that showing that African-American families, and especially female-headed households, were having more evictions. And when I looked at the census tract data, it was more north side census tracts that had those high percentages of 1 in 10 households being evicted back in 2016. But yeah, I don't know necessarily all of those details that you asked. But yeah, the eviction numbers have definitely declined, but we don't know if that's a long-term trend yet, or if that's still kind of based on some of the extra supports that have been in place.
And are they typically associated with a large management company or individual houses? Yeah.
That is a good question. And I don't know the answer to that. But MCW has been tracking the evictions in more detail, and they would definitely be able to answer that question.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah. So back to Amani, the pilot in Amani was again really focused on housing, but and the reason why I guess housing was the focus and where this whole effort came from, as I mentioned, was this neighborhood revitalization plan that was created several years ago. And this was facilitated by the Dominican Center, which is a community-based organization in Amani. It was very resident-driven neighborhood plan. And this is a quote from that plan, that residents really viewed housing as a means of reducing blight, reducing crime, attracting economic development, and improving quality of life. And this idea of focusing on a block by block approach as opposed to scattered improvements throughout the neighborhood came out of that plan as well. And so then a block was chosen to focus on North 26th Street. And you can see the conditions or the kind of quality of that block at the time in terms of the mix of renter and owner occupied housing units. There were 3 vacant city-owned or bank-owned homes on the block and a couple of vacant lots. And so it was a real mix on the block. And that was partly why it was chosen, is that it had a lot of different kind of different improvements that could be made. The vacant homes could be renovated to become home buying opportunities for low-income home buyers. Home improvements could be made both for homeowners and renters. And then the other really important part of this pilot is that it was designed to be a multifaceted, multi-pronged kind of effort that wasn't only focused on housing improvements, but also trying to tie in worker training as a key part of it, and specifically trying to train residents from the neighborhood in construction and people with barriers to employment, such as criminal records. A lot of the workers who got trained through the pilot were at or had recently been at the House of Corrections. So that was a key focus of this effort. And again, in boosting some home ownership opportunities and making some neighborhood safety improvements, as well as community engagement and community building. So very kind of multi-goal effort. And to accomplish this, a bunch of different partner organizations played major roles. The Dominican Center I mentioned is a community-based group in Imani. They helped develop the plan, and then they played the lead role, or they have played the lead role in the pilot, working between residents, the city, other partners, and convening all of these partners every 2 weeks to meet and move the work of the pilot forward. Imani United is a neighborhood association, so neighborhood residents have been part of that group that meets every 2 weeks. Ezekiel CDC is the lead contractor doing the home repair work, as well as they're the trainer that is training workers in construction work. Northwestern Mutual Foundation has been a key funder, as well as just a strategic planning organization that's brought in a lot of partners into the project. And you see the other partners here. Milwaukee Christian Center, I want to mention as well. They acquired 2 of the 3 vacant homes on the pilot block and have been renovating them, including one that involves youth training. So training youth to in construction as they prepare those homes for sale. And so here you can see, hopefully, some of the accomplishments that the pilot has tracked. You can see some of the improvements that have been made to homes, the training goals that have been met largely, and some of the community engagement efforts that have been part of this pilot. So a lot of homes, I believe there were more than 20 homes on the block that had some type of repairs, as well as the 3 vacant homes have all been completely renovated and will be put on the market this coming year. One of those homes is now the headquarters of Ezekiel CDC, the training and contractor that has led a lot of this work on the block. And here you can see before and after photos of that house. They actually moved their headquarters to this block. They acquired this home and renovated it while training workers. And so it served as their headquarters and as the training house, and also played a key role of providing visibility and accessibility to the pilot for residents on the block to understand what the pilot was, interact with this organization, and have their questions answered. Because as I mentioned, a key part of this study was to understand the challenges that arose, and one of them was distrust in this whole project, and people feeling like they weren't sure what this was all about. There was a lot of skepticism, also a lot of distrust of working with the city, because the pilot involved, the idea was to tap city funding and programs to help pay for the home repairs and renovation work. And a lot of households were wary of opening their finances and their homes and the conditions of their homes to the city. And so there was a need for very extensive resident engagement, including, door-to-door conversations with every resident to see answer their questions, see what their home, needed. But also having this new headquarters for Ezekiel on the block, like I said, was really key to that visibility and that accessibility. Funding for all of this work was another major challenge. And here I'm showing what was budgeted, how they thought they would pay for the work, and then what had actually been, the revenue sources as of fall of 2021. The idea initially was that this funding from the city, that was actually federal funding from the program called HOME, was going to pay for all of this work. And so they applied for, and the city dedicated $500,000 in funding from this federal program to the pilot. And so that was going to be the main funding source. But what happened, and what the pilot leaders realized over time, is that the home program is very restrictive. It can only be used for certain things like hard construction costs and materials. It can't be used for training. It can't be used for administration or community engagement. So that became a real barrier. It was really a kind of a conflict between the way this pilot was designed and the funding source they thought was going to be the key to paying for it. Another issue was that they started working on a lot of these home repair projects because they were eager to get the work done. And these city programs and federal funded programs like home really require a lot of paperwork and inspections, and really like going through the process in order to get then reimbursed when the expenses for the work is completed. And so that became a barrier as well, that they had gotten the work done and couldn't get it reimbursed. So essentially Northwestern Mutual had financed all of the work on this pilot as of the time we looked at it, though since then a little bit of that home funding has been utilized for a couple of homes. But the lessons learned from that are really to exhaust any opportunities to use restrictive funding sources like those city programs and federally funded programs, especially, that have a lot of strings attached, before you tap into any kind of flexible funding like was available from Northwestern Mutual. That was very flexible and should have probably been saved for later to fill in gaps, as well as the design of the pilot really would have required more funding sources to be in place from the beginning, and more flexible funding sources that could cover training. If training is going to be part of this, either it has to be sort of separated, where certain homes are going to involve training, and there's funding and programs that can go to those homes, and then the rest of the renovation work can be funded separately, and it doesn't have that conflict of how the funding is and the programs are designed. That was sort of basically a takeaway, is just to develop a business model, to know what funding source can pay for what, and to use it at the appropriate time in the project's evolution. And then the last thing we took from this was there is an array of city programs that support home repair and renovation. And once the pilot leaders realized that the home program wasn't going to pay for everything, they started to try to work with the city and try to tap some of these other city home repair programs, and found them very confusing, difficult to access, and there was no real easy way to navigate them. And so that was a takeaway for to try to simplify the city's programs and accessibility to those programs. From the city's part, they really did do a lot to try to support the pilot. They in some cases it's really HUD that's driving the restrictions on these programs, but I just wanted to mention that as well. So the takeaways here being resident engagement in a kind of block by block revitalization effort like this. Resident engagement is really key. Also, a strong understanding of the city's housing programs and how to navigate them. Those are things that not many organizations have, we found. And so if this work is going to continue, it may require capacity building, especially if it's going to be attempted in other neighborhoods. And then again, the financing, often we're gonna need a variety of funding sources and a lot of planning on how to use them, and some flexible funding sources. And one of the things I wanted to share is that this pilot is now sort of in its final phases. They're doing repairs to a few homes still, but most of that is done. Most of the renovation work to the 3 formerly vacant homes is done. And as I said, that's going on the market. And they've now turned their attention to 2 more blocks in the neighborhood. So they're calling those the beta blocks, and they're going to be trying to apply what they learned from this pilot and improve upon it on these other blocks. And they have actually secured some CDBG funding, which is more flexible than the home funding. And so basically the idea is now to try to learn from that and apply it and expand it to other parts of the neighborhood. So I'll leave that one there. If there's any questions.
I think you started to address one of my questions, was because I'm familiar working on like the Lindsay Heights, which was many blocks and, you know, almost 100 homes. And then there was a ripple effect of over 100 homes, and Layton Boulevard West has done that too over many blocks. I was curious your thoughts on this, you know, focusing only on one block instead of many blocks. And then it sounds like they're just going to keep adding on, but how do you reach a broader neighborhood? Or what are your
that was
thoughts
a
on
question. That was a question I had. And this is one model, and you've mentioned others. I don't think this is the only model, but it's kind of an interesting one where they did want to do all of this work right in one block. But like I asked the same question, how is this going to expand? Wouldn't it take forever to, I think there are over 100 blocks in Amani, and to touch the whole neighborhood? And the response was that these beta blocks, so the next one is going to be 2 blocks, and then hopefully after that it will expand further and take on a bigger set of blocks and go from there. But yes, this isn't, you know, it will take a while to really cover the whole neighborhood. And and it is only one way of approaching it. Another is, you know, scattering these improvements in a broader geography.
Even when they're scattered, we looked at how they would be clustered. So there's one more sort of question asking for a little more clarity. She noticed that the landlord equity and sale of home revenue were lower than budgeted. Can you elaborate on that? And what lessons would you apply for the project in the future? And do you think they need to rely on any market-based funding?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember this because I do remember that so I mentioned that Legal Aid Society ended up being a major partner, and that was for a variety of reasons. One of those was that I think later in the process, they developed sort of a protocol for requiring landlords and owners to put in a small amount of funding whenever whenever improvements were being made. The city programs do require that. They require some match in many cases. But yeah, I think legal aid did set something up later that, you know, to have some skin in the game, I guess, from landlords and tenants. But at the time, you know, when we looked at it, they hadn't really done that yet.
Okay, so that can be a good lessons learned, and then evaluated on the next couple blocks how that works. And then here's one other. What communications plan supports this project? I'm not sure exactly what this is asking. Is this asking about how do you take this information and go to the public? I'll ask that person to just clarify, and then we can have you go to your last project.
Yeah.
Hey there. Yeah, I was wondering, a lot of times policy forum reports or this plan sort of stay in the community that created it. And so I was wondering if this report is available for, say, the residents of the 100 neighboring blocks, not necessarily in full, but sort of tidbits of like, this is one of the strong, easy to use repair programs, and here's how to apply for it, or other tidbits.
In terms of the research and the report, and communicating it, the partners did do a convening. It was sort of like a taking stock of the first phase and looking to the next phases that did involve a lot of neighborhood residents. And I presented our research at that event. I didn't mention that the report also involved a lot of interviewing of people from both the organizations and some residents and people who worked on who were trained through the pilot. So their voices came in, and then I shared back the report with all of those individuals. But in terms of helping residents with finding the home repair services that they can apply for, that's really driven by Dominican Center. They're the neighborhood organization that's driving this effort, and they have community buy-in. They know the residents, they work with the residents, and through this pilot have learned about the programs. It was quite frustrating for them, and I definitely, that was a takeaway in trying to navigate and learn about these programs. But they are really playing the major role in helping residents to understand and apply for and work through the application process.
That's a great question, because you need a local stakeholder that continues this. They're the champion. So last question is, did the safety of that block improve?
I think that was
too early.
Well, that was one aspect that, you know, I mean, they had specifically suggested, I think early on, putting in, you know, camera things on people's doors, and speed humps, and those things, as I understood it, have not actually happened. When I was on the pilot block, they hadn't happened, and as far as I understand, they haven't so far. But I think on the community engagement side of things, there were a bunch of events that have occurred, and this house that has become, like I mentioned, Ezekiel's headquarters, has sort of become a community hub where, you know, when I was there, there were people who were there who were trainees. There were people just, you know, from Ezekiel that were at the house talking to, you know, residents would come by. It just felt like kind of a community hub. And so that was kind of a cool thing to witness.
Great, thanks.
So the last piece I wanted to share was a kind of broader study we did on the city of Milwaukee's full spectrum of affordable housing programs and activities. And this project came to us from a couple of local foundations that had were trying to focus their efforts more on affordable housing and wanting to better understand. They were finding the city's programs, again, kind of confusing, and trying to understand what all the city was doing when it came to housing, so that they could complement that with their own efforts. And so in this report, we're really breaking all that down. But the first part of what we did was to kind of give a landscape look at some of the multiple housing challenges that the city was facing at that time and continues to face, really. One of them being rent burden, as a very common issue in Milwaukee. Over half of the households in Milwaukee are considered rent burden, and this means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent, which is, you know, quite a bit higher than the national and state rates. We were seeing home ownership decline over the long term. This is the share of all occupied housing units that were owner occupied continuing to decline. And also considerable racial disparities in home ownership rates. And we've done some follow-up research on this issue, but as you can see, we have very big racial disparities, especially the difference between Black and white households, and that has actually expanded over the last decade. We know that earlier in the last decade, the foreclosure crisis and the recession caused home ownership rates to decline, and especially affected the Black community. But we have seen some stabilization or rebounding of home ownership rates. However, that has not been the case for the Black population in Milwaukee. And that actually stood out also compared to nationally. One, we see that the Black homeownership rate in Milwaukee is far lower than it is nationally. And also that rate has stabilized nationally while it's continued to decline over the last 5 years in Milwaukee, or since 2015. We also have an aging housing stock in Milwaukee with about 2/3 of the housing units built prior to 1960. So that leads to a need for a lot of home repair and maintenance work. So a lot of different challenges as the backdrop, but this study was really focused on understanding, again, what the city of Milwaukee, city government does with housing, partly because the city has a little bit more flexibility. It has some more discretionary funding, local funding, as well as CDBG funding, which is quite flexible. But we started by kind of laying out what the city does when it comes to housing versus other public agencies that provide housing services in Milwaukee, the Housing Authority, the county, and the state. For example, the city doesn't provide any kind of rental assistance, but other governments do. The city provides a lot of other types of services. But then a big part of what we did, and you don't have to really understand all of this detail, but I'm sharing it to show you when we dove into all of the programs the city provides when it comes to housing. We found, about 20, I want to say. There's a huge array of housing programs, and they're being administered by 4 different city agencies or offices. But in the report, we really dive into the details of how they're funded, where the funding is coming from, how much funding the city has dedicated to each of these programs over this 5-year period, and how many houses or housing units or households were being served. You can really get the details in the report of each of these programs. And this was sort of the first time that this had all been pulled together. I had to work with all of those different departments to get this information. But what it allowed us to do was to see how fragmented the system of services was, but also where the city is prioritizing its efforts around housing, which we found almost half of the funding the city was using was going towards home repair services for current homeowners, as opposed to other types of services. We also found the city putting more funding than it has in the past to expanding the supply of affordable housing, usually by contributing to affordable multifamily rental housing development, which was a newer strategy the city was providing. But not a lot going into home ownership services geared towards new prospective home buyers. And this focus on home repairs for current homeowners might make sense given the city's aging housing stock. There are a lot of low-income homeowners, so it could be like a home ownership preservation strategy, as well as it could be smaller amounts of funding, given the city's in a pretty tight financial situation. Smaller amounts of funding can help with home repairs as opposed to bigger investments that are required to develop new affordable housing or help people purchase homes. Another part of this study, though, was to compare at a big picture level what Milwaukee was doing with some peer cities. And we had some takeaways from each of these cities, Minneapolis being one, quite a different city, but also still had some really interesting insights. One thing we found was that the city of Minneapolis had established a housing policy and development division within its planning department where all of its housing efforts are located. So it's all focused in one division. It has a director that's really leading all of the city housing efforts. So that really differed and contrasted from Milwaukee, where we have this really fragmented system and no housing director. We found far more funding going into affordable housing development in Minneapolis, but that could be partly due to it's a much less affordable city. It's a much faster growing city. And also the state of Minnesota actually handles home repair programs there. So that frees up the city to focus more on affordable housing development. We also found the city had developed a comprehensive plan recently, and it had a really strong housing component, including a number of new housing policies, including one of those being eliminating single-family zoning. That got a lot of attention nationally, but it had a lot of other policies in it as well around housing. And then lastly, we saw the city was working with the county and state and other private sector organizations to coordinate how and where it was investing in affordable housing development. So it wasn't making those decisions in a vacuum, but really collaborating with those other partners. And then Detroit was another city we thought was interesting. Similar to Minneapolis, Detroit has a housing and revitalization department they've established fairly recently. So they have a housing director. Again, everything is targeted or focused into one department with a director. They have also done planning around housing. I should say that at the time, the city of Milwaukee did not have a housing plan. And so both Minneapolis, through its comprehensive plan, and Detroit had specifically developed a multifamily strategic housing plan and was working on a single family strategic housing plan, so that those were really setting a vision for how to strengthen affordable housing in the city. And those were things that we thought we could learn from here in Milwaukee. And another thing was that Detroit was doing quite a bit to leverage private sector funding for its housing efforts, both through its major home repair program, which it partnered with the local LISC office and a bank to double the amount of funding that was available through this revolving loan fund for home repair. And so that was one way. And then another way was that Detroit actually created an affordable housing leverage fund that's really focused on supporting development of new affordable, multifamily affordable housing, as well as renovating affordable housing, and was leveraging funding from philanthropic organizations, private sector organizations, community development, financial institutions, to supplement city and federal funding for that work. So a lot of takeaways from this. Overall, we learned we recommended that the city work on the organization and leadership of its housing efforts to streamline its programs and potentially add a housing director, to do strategic planning around housing, given the city didn't have an affordable housing plan, and to do more around private sector engagement, both on the funding side and on the coordination of services and activities. And a lot of action has come out of this report. In 2021, an organization called the Community Development Alliance. So this is an alliance that involves the city, the county, a bunch of local foundations and community development organizations. You can see some of those organizations shown here, all came together, basically decided that a plan was needed, and a collaborative plan was the best approach, where it wouldn't be just one organization creating a housing plan, but it would be collaborative, and it would focus on racial equity, given some of the racial gaps we see in the home ownership rates and in other aspects, including evictions. So this plan includes strategies to address both home ownership and the rental market, affordable rental market. And it has strategies both on that are sort of offensive in nature, for example, trying to increase home ownership and add Black and Latino homeowners, as well as to preserve Black and Latino home ownership. And so a number of strategies for each were developed. And the ones that rose to the top through this process that involved dozens of organizations, really, and then sort of the consensus items are these that I'm showing that were prioritized for implementation in this year and next year. And these largely are now being implemented. So for example, the first one, grow homebuyer counseling and down payment assistance. One way that has been occurring is that the city created a new home down payment assistance program that's providing grants to home buyers. So this is kind of gets at a gap we saw in what the city was doing, as well as one of the strategies that came out of this plan was a need to expand those opportunities. And so far, this seems to be making a pretty big impact. A second thing was to create an acquisition fund to combat predatory acquisition. You've probably heard and seen that there is this trend of out-of-state investors coming in and purchasing homes in Milwaukee, specifically single-family homes through bulk purchases, and then converting them to rentals as an investment opportunity. And these are largely happening on the north side. And so this issue has been getting a lot more attention. This acquisition fund has been created now with Axe Housing, which is a member of the CDA, the Community Development Alliance, leading this fund that is set up to purchase homes to prevent them from going into these bulk sales and going to out-of-state investors, and then preserve them for home ownership. Axe Housing is an organization that helps home buyers prepare for and purchase a home with counseling and home buyer assistance. So that is now being implemented. The plan is for this acquisition fund to purchase at least 100 homes in 2023. And then another strategy that was being prioritized was to actually build new homes, small, modest size homes on vacant lots in the city as another strategy for boosting home ownership opportunities. The challenge with this is that by purchasing new homes, even on vacant lots that are very affordable to purchase, and building them small, still results in homes that are estimated at like a $180,000 to $200,000 cost. So it's too expensive for a lot of home buyers to purchase. So this strategy is geared towards subsidizing that, both facilitating the development of these homes and then subsidizing the cost when it comes to the sale, so that people can purchase these homes at $100,000 to $120,000 and be able to afford them. So a number of efforts really happening to implement this plan that really seems really exciting. A lot more activity around housing in general, investment occurring around housing in Milwaukee than has in the past. So we're excited for all that to happen, and happy for the small role we played in helping to move some of that along.
So thank you very much. It's been really insightful. I think the data is what's been informative as well, but then identifying where there are opportunities. As we all know, even in this last example, you can build the house, but if it's still not affordable, it's a different type of strategy that you have to look for. We have a couple questions. And again, if you have other comments or questions, you can type those into the chat. One question is the TIF developer financed or bonded, and why not TIF neighborhoods? Might be beyond your policy knowledge, but
is the TIF developer, or say that again?
And Pat, if you're still here, you can unmic and clarify. Is the TIF developer or developer financed or bonded? I'm not sure what that question is, because
so TIF has been used more often through this developer financed approach, where the developer pays for the development and then is reimbursed with the increased tax increment that comes in, as opposed to the city bonding for it and the city being reimbursed. Specifically when it comes to affordable housing, I think that varies. When I mentioned that the city is doing more with TIF to support affordable housing, it's doing that in a variety of ways. But when it comes to development, it's often supplementing projects that already have tax, I'm blanking on the word, tax credits, that federal or state tax credits dedicated to them. So it's just a piece of the puzzle that is supporting them. And I think it really varies from project to project, whether they're developer financed TIFs or city bonded TIFs.
Well, and you have to negotiate that up front. I think that's the other issue.
Right.
So when you talked about Minneapolis and Detroit, there's a question about, because there was state and regional aspects. What impact do the regional planning authorities have in those comparative cases?
The regional,
Well, because they're partners. So how vital do you think the regional planning authorities were in the success that those communities are seeing? We have lots of partners in all the projects you've been talking about. So do you think the regional aspect is critical?
I mean, I guess I can't really evaluate that. I thought that really the takeaway from Minneapolis for me was that when it came to deciding what affordable housing developments to support, it was making its own decisions, but it was not doing it without knowing what other organizations were doing, what projects they were supporting, so they could know, for example, where in the city do we need affordable housing? Where should we prioritize our investments because we know what the state is doing to support or what other private organizations are doing. So that was kind of the takeaway there, was we might be able to do more of that in Milwaukee to coordinate.
Okay. There's another question. What are the pros and cons of subsidizing the costs, for example, of the 120 homes over creating duplexes or more dense housing on those lots? That is an interesting question, because a lot of the, we just did some work last year looking at actually the King neighborhood, identifying where could you do infill, separate from a conversation of adaptive reuse. We were all looking at, again, if you want to increase home ownership and build 100 new homes, where do they fit?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, not one that I can necessarily answer. The CDA is the entity that is really moving this along, which includes all these different partners, as I mentioned. And so the plan to focus on single family homes, I think that what I thought was interesting about that approach is that when you look at the history of the size of new single family homes, they've just grown bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And the CDA has looked at this where the Fair Housing Act came into being. That's essentially when single family homes development really tapered off in Milwaukee, and where new single family homes were very large and mostly in the suburbs. So this approach seems interesting to me, just trying to get at small, modest sized homes, but I have no idea if that is the most effective for the resources going into it. And that is a good question for for the CDA or for future research to try to determine.
Mm-hmm. So we have one more question, and also Jenny will put the survey in the chat, so everybody please fill that out. Give us your comments, what you heard from Joe today, as well as identifying topics and even specific speakers that you'd like us to consider for future Innovative Cities lectures. So I would, what's interesting when you talk about the comparison of adaptive reuse and new construction, it also, for us, it's always been about the age and the condition of that house. So I know that the strategy is to look at, is it feasible to do adaptive reuse? So it is a difficult question to answer. And there's a question here, I think, just specifically about your data, about the comparison of racial disparities and how does that correlate with economic disparities? Do you have specific
That's
data?
a really good question, because as I mentioned, we've done some follow-up research where we've taken a closer look at this issue of racial disparities in home ownership, and we compared Milwaukee with other cities. And when we did that, we looked at 10 other peer cities, and we found a bigger gap too between Milwaukee and all of those. The biggest gap between Black and Hispanic home ownership and white home ownership rates. And when we've looked into it, especially when you compare it with national data, we do have bigger income disparities in Milwaukee by race than exist nationally. So that could certainly be one factor, and it's one that we pointed out as one factor driving those disparities. And that also extends beyond Milwaukee. We've done research that's shown this issue is really statewide. The disparities are even bigger in a lot of, and when you look at the rest of the state. So so that can definitely be one of the driving factors.
Yeah, this is a topic we could continue talking about, but it is positive to see some of the outcomes, you know, from projects that were done, you know, even 15 years ago to the current projects and all the different partners that are part of it. Are you able to share any of the other studies that you did, or the copies from Detroit and Minneapolis? Is there a
Yes.
link?
And
If you share it with Jenny, she
sure.
can mail it out to the full group.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can do that. Sure. All of our research is free and available to the public on our website, and I can send some of the specific links as well into some of the plans. I see also Jaidi in the chat. I shout out to Jaidi. She and I worked together on a research report, one of these housing reports several years ago. And she also is pointing out she noted the CDA's website where you can go, and I can send this as well, but the link to where this housing plan is located. And also I would want to share for anybody who's interested, if you're not involved in the CDA, they do quarterly meetings where they're updating and getting input from whoever wants to participate in this plan implementation. And so you can get involved if you're interested.
So great resources. So again, for those of you still on, Jenny will put a lot of those links in the follow-up email that she sends out, along with a link for the recording. So great knowledge, great information for our community, but also our region. So really appreciate you, Joe, spending some time with us and sharing your knowledge and your research. So thanks to everyone who's joined us. Have a great holiday, and we will see you in the new year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.